The wind howled through the dense forest, rattling the skeletal branches like whispering ghosts. A thick veil of mist slithered across the forest floor, swallowing the moonlight and leaving only shifting shadows in its wake. The cold was biting, relentless, seeping through every layer of clothing as if trying to gnaw at the bone beneath. Somewhere, in the vast and endless wilderness, a child's ragged breath trembled through the air. She was alone. Emma had wandered too far from the hiking trail. One moment, she was running ahead, laughing at the way her boots crunched the leaves beneath her feet. The next, she turned, expecting to see her father behind her, only to find nothing but an ocean of trees stretching endlessly in every direction. She had screamed his name, then again and again, but the only answer was silence. Now, the stillness of the woods pressed against her like a suffocating blanket. Her tiny hands clutched the edges of her coat, pulling it tighter against her trembling frame. Her breath formed misty clouds in the freezing air, and every step she took felt heavier than the last. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and the darkness was absolute. Then movement. A rustling sound in the undergrowth sent ice through her veins. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but growing closer with every heartbeat. She turned her head sharply, eyes darting through the shifting shadows, searching, praying it was just the wind. But it wasn't. Glowing amber eyes flickered in the darkness. One pair, then another, and another. Her breath hitched. The shapes emerged from the black void of the forest, silent and predatory. A pack of wolves. Their fur, silvered by the moonlight that barely broke through the tangled canopy, rippled as they moved with effortless grace. Their eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, calculating. A strangled whimper escaped Emma's throat. She knew better than to run. Some instinct deep inside her whispered that prey runs. Prey gets chased. So she stood there, her legs like lead, her heart a drumbeat in her chest, her mind screaming for her father, though she knew he wouldn't hear. The wolves surrounded her, their large bodies pressing against the night like living shadows. The biggest of them, a massive beast with a coat as dark as ink, stepped forward. It lowered its head, sniffing the air between them. Emma squeezed her eyes shut. She waited for the teeth, the bite, the pain, but none came. Instead, a sound rumbled through the night. A low, guttural noise, almost like a whine. Her eyes fluttered open. The large wolf tilted its head, its ears flicking forward. Its gaze, though piercing, wasn't filled with hunger. It was something else, something Emma couldn't understand. Then, as if on some silent command, the wolves did the unthinkable. Emma Carter had always been a quiet child, the kind who clung to the edges of rooms rather than stepping into the center of them. She preferred books over playgrounds, silence over small talk, and the company of animals over people. There was something about the way animals looked at her. No judgment, no expectations, just quiet understanding. But there was something else about Emma, something that had always made her feel different. She was 7 years old when she first realized she could hear things others couldn't. Not voices exactly, but feelings, emotions that didn't belong to her, pressing into her mind like distant echoes. It started small. A stray cat she found outside her apartment, shivering in the rain, had looked at her with wide, golden eyes, and suddenly, she just knew it was terrified. She felt its fear like a tight fist in her chest, the way it trembled through its tiny frame. That day, she brought the cat home without thinking. When her father asked how she knew it needed help, she only shrugged, unable to explain it. It happened again with a neighbor's dog. She felt its deep loneliness even before she learned its owners were planning to move away and leave it behind. Her father, Daniel Carter, was a biologist, logical, scientific, and deeply skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured or studied. Emma had learned quickly not to tell him about the things she felt. He loved her, but he wouldn't understand. So, she kept her secret locked inside, letting the emotions of animals whisper through her like a language no one else could hear. But there was one moment, one night, that changed everything. It happened when she was 10. Her father had taken her on a camping trip deep into the forests of Montana. where the stars burned bright and the world felt vast and untamed. It was supposed to be an adventure, a way to bond after her mother's passing, but Emma had felt uneasy from the moment they arrived. That night, as she lay curled in her sleeping bag, a strange sensation washed over her. Something old, something watching. The feeling pressed against her skin, sent chills down her spine. And then she heard it. A howl. It wasn't just any howl. It was layered, woven with something deeper than sound. It was sorrow, longing, something almost human in its depth. The moment it reached her ears, her breath caught in her throat, and before she knew it, her legs carried her outside the tent, bare feet pressing into the cold earth. A wolf stood at the edge of their camp. Massive, with a coat as black as the night itself, it stared at her with glowing amber eyes. But there was no threat in its gaze. Instead, there was recognition, as if it knew her, as if it had been waiting. Emma couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The world shrank to just her and the wolf, and in that moment, something inside her shifted. And then, her father's voice, sharp with panic. "Emma!" The spell broke. The wolf disappeared into the darkness as quickly as it had come. Her father grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her gently. "What were you thinking? You could have been hurt." I wasn't afraid," she whispered. Her father didn't understand. He only saw the danger, not the connection, not the way the wolf had looked at her like it had known something she didn't. After that night, she never spoke about it again. But deep inside, she knew that moment meant something. The wolf had meant something. And now, years later, lost in the heart of a freezing forest, surrounded by glowing eyes in the dark, she couldn't help but wonder. Was this fate? Had they come for her again? The Blackwood Forest was a place whispered about in hushed tones, a place where the trees grew too close together, where the wind carried voices that didn't belong. It stretched for miles, a vast, untamed wilderness untouched by the modern world, where the only laws were those of nature. The locals spoke of it with both reverence and fear. Some said it was cursed, others called it sacred, but everyone agreed on one thing. You didn't go wandering into Blackwood alone. There were stories, of course. Every town had its legends, and Blackwood had plenty. Some said the forest had no end, that people who strayed too far never returned, swallowed whole by the endless maze of gnarled trees. Others spoke of strange lights flickering between the trunks, shadows moving where there should be none. And then there was the legend of the ghost wolves, massive, spectral creatures that appeared when the moon was at its highest, their howls carrying an ancient sorrow. Emma had read about the forest before their trip. The accounts varied, but they all carried the same warning. Blackwood was not a place for the lost. Now, standing in the heart of it, she understood why. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It clung to her skin, filled her lungs with the deep, musky perfume of the wild. The ground was uneven beneath her boots, blanketed in a bed of fallen leaves that muffled even the softest steps. But despite the silence, the forest felt alive. Something was always moving just beyond sight, a branch shifting, a rustle in the underbrush, the faint whisper of something unseen. The wind slithered through the trees, its fingers cold against the back of her neck, carrying with it the distant echo of a howl. Above her, the branches wove together like skeletal fingers, creating a canopy that swallowed most of the moonlight. Only small slivers of silver managed to pierce through, casting long, shifting shadows that danced across the ground. The trees themselves were ancient, their bark rough and scarred with time, their roots coiling through the earth like veins. Some had twisted into unnatural shapes, their trunks bending at impossible angles as if writhing toward the sky. There was no sign of human presence, no paths, no broken twigs from passing hikers, no distant hum of traffic or the glow of city lights. Just endless, suffocating wilderness. Then there were the sounds, soft at first, barely noticeable, but growing louder the longer she stood there. The rhythmic dripping of water from unseen places. The whisper of leaves shifting, though there was no breeze. The distant snap of a twig. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. The feeling pressed against her, cold and certain, like invisible eyes watching her from the darkness. Every instinct screamed at her to move, but her feet remained rooted in place, locked by an invisible force that felt eerily familiar. And then another sound, low, rumbling, too deep to be the wind. A growl. It vibrated through the air, a warning, a presence making itself known. Slowly, Emma turned her head, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Glowing eyes stared back at her. Not one pair. Many. The wolves had come, but the forest did not feel like theirs. It felt like something older, something watching from the depths of Blackwood, waiting for her. The wolves did not move. Emma felt their eyes on her, watchful, intelligent, unblinking. Their bodies were eerily still, their breath misting in the cold air. The largest of them, the black wolf with the piercing amber eyes, stood at the front, its massive form silhouetted against the darkness. For a long moment, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, only the weight of their gaze pressing against her skin. Then the forest changed. The air thickened, heavy with something unseen, something ancient. The sounds of the woods, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, vanished in an instant, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The silence was unnatural, suffocating. And then a whisper. It came from behind her. Soft, faint, like the wind, but not. Her blood turned to ice. She turned sharply, her breath caught in her throat, but there was nothing, only endless trees and the shifting mist curling through their roots. The wolves did not react. They remained still, their heads slightly lowered, ears flicking forward as if listening to something beyond her hearing. Emma's pulse pounded against her skull. She knew what she had heard. It was no trick of the wind, no imagined noise born from fear. It had been a voice, a whisper, her name, Emma. Her breath hitched. It came again, closer. She took a step back, her body trembling with something primal, something deep in her bones that told her she was not supposed to be here. The forest felt wrong, twisted in ways she could not explain. And then she saw it. Between the trees, just beyond the reach of the dim moonlight, something moved. A shape, tall, too tall, its form shifting within the mist like smoke. It stood in the distance, watching. Emma's throat tightened. She wanted to run, to tear through the woods until she found her father, but she couldn't move. The weight of the presence pinned her in place. The wolves reacted now. A low growl rumbled through the pack, a sound of warning, of unease. Their hackles bristled, their bodies tensed as they turned their attention toward the shifting figure. The black wolf let out a deep, guttural snarl, its amber eyes burning with something fierce. The shape did not retreat. It only tilted its head, as if observing. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The mist swallowed it whole, leaving nothing behind but the ghost of its presence. The forest exhaled. The sounds returned, the rustling leaves, the distant hum of insects. But the air was still heavy, thick with something unspoken. The wolves began to move. The black one stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Its eyes locked onto hers, intense and knowing. It let out a sharp huff of breath, then turned, padding away into the darkness. One by one, the others followed, disappearing into the trees like shadows. Emma was alone again, but the whisper remained, and she knew, without a doubt, that something in the forest had been waiting for her. And it was not finished yet. Emma's legs finally obeyed her, though they felt like lead beneath her. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts as she took a single step backward, then another. The wolves had gone, but their presence still lingered, an echo in the cold night air. The whisper was gone too, or at least she could no longer hear it. But something had changed. The forest wasn't just dark anymore. It felt different, like she had crossed an invisible threshold into something older, something not meant for human presence. The wind had died completely. Not even the leaves above stirred. The silence pressed down on her, heavy and unnatural, like a suffocating force wrapping around her throat. And then footsteps, soft at first, distant. Emma's chest tightened. She turned sharply, scanning the trees. The mist swirled around the trunks, stretching into ghostly fingers, shifting but revealing nothing. Then another step, closer. This time, it wasn't like the wolves' silent, predatory movements. It was deliberate, heavy, human. Her breath stilled. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely breaking the thick air. Nothing. Then came the third step, right behind her. A sharp, icy dread shot down her spine. Emma spun around. There was nothing, but she felt it, the weight of something right there, standing too close, just beyond her vision. Her skin prickled, every hair on her body rising with a sensation that went beyond fear. It was as if something was watching, not with eyes, but with something deeper, something that could see through her. A low hum filled the air. Not a sound, exactly, but a vibration pressing against her skull. Her ears popped, as if she had just been submerged underwater. The pressure was unbearable, an invisible force tightening around her mind. The trees stretched taller. Or had they always been this high? The darkness deepened, thickening like ink. She felt lightheaded, her vision blurring at the edges. And then, just before the dizziness could pull her under, she saw it. A single handprint. It was pressed into the bark of a nearby tree, large, too large, and black as though burned into the wood itself. It hadn't been there before. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She took a shaky step toward it, reaching out as if to confirm it was real. Her fingers hovered just above the charred surface. The moment she got too close, the whisper returned, but this time it wasn't distant. It was inside her ear. "Run!" A sudden, violent gust of wind tore through the trees, breaking the suffocating silence. The branches rattled, shaking loose dead leaves that spiraled around her like dying embers. The forest roared to life, as though it had only been pretending to sleep. Emma didn't think. She ran. Her feet pounded against the earth, her lungs burning with each breath of icy air. The mist wrapped around her ankles, grasping like unseen hands trying to pull her down. The trees blurred past her, towering shadows closing in, stretching impossibly tall, their branches curling inward as if trying to trap her inside. The footsteps followed. Not hers. Not human. Something fast. Something wrong. She didn't dare look back. Ahead, the trees thinned. A clearing. Faint light spilled into the open space, the moon breaking through the tangled canopy above. She pushed forward, her legs screaming in protest, but the second she crossed the threshold, silence. Everything stopped. The wind, the movement, the footsteps. She stood in the middle of the clearing, panting, her breath forming frantic clouds in the night air. Nothing moved. The forest behind her was still, but she knew it was there, watching, waiting. Then a new sound, not footsteps, not whispers, a soft, rhythmic clicking. Her head turned slowly toward the source. And there, standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden within the trees, was a figure. Tall, unnaturally thin, its face obscured in the darkness. But she could see its hand, long, bony fingers, pressed against the bark, right next to the burned handprint. Click, click, click. It wasn't moving. It wasn't speaking, just watching. Then, a second handprint appeared, right next to the first. Emma's breath hitched. The figure didn't move. But now, there were 2 handprints. Then 3, 4, 5. They spread across the tree like a disease, blooming in blackened patches, charred into the wood as if something inside the forest itself was claiming the land. And then, without a single sound, the figure stepped back and disappeared. Gone, like it had never been there at all. But the handprints remained. And Emma knew. This was only the beginning. Emma stood frozen, her breath shallow, her pulse erratic. The forest was silent again, but the weight of unseen eyes pressed against her skin. The handprints, those unnatural, blackened scars, still marred the tree's bark, stretching wider with each passing second, spreading like something alive. And then, the whisper returned. But this time, it wasn't soft. It was a chorus. Hundreds of voices, layered over one another. a cacophony of murmurs bleeding into the air. Some were distant, others impossibly close, curling into her ears with eerie precision. "Emma, you've come back?" Her stomach turned to ice. Back? A flicker of something surfaced in her mind, something buried deep, an old memory, distorted, hidden behind a thick fog she couldn't quite push through. No, that wasn't possible. She had never been here before. Had she? The wolf's presence was gone, swallowed by the vast nothingness around her. The mist thickened, stretching long, curling tendrils around her legs, slithering like something sentient. And then, a sound, low, wet, like something shifting in the darkness, like flesh peeling away from bone. Emma turned, and the breath in her throat died. The tree, the one covered in handprints, was bleeding. Thick, black ichor seeped from the burned marks, oozing down the bark like tar. The scent hit her next, rotting metallic like old blood left to fester. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath, as if watching what would happen next. And then the tree moved. A deep groan reverberated through the clearing, with straining, cracking. The bark split apart, widening into something unnatural. A mouth. Not carved, not metaphorical. A real, yawning, gaping mouth. It stretched open, impossibly wide, lined with jagged, splintered teeth. The black ichor dripped from its lips, pooling at its base like something alive, writhing in slow, serpentine motions. Emma stumbled back, and then it spoke, a voice that did not belong to any living thing. "You should not have come." The clearing shifted. The trees swayed though there was no wind, their trunks twisting like they were alive, writhing in agony. The earth beneath her feet pulsed, breathing, as if the very land itself had become something sentient, something old. And then the handprints moved. One by one, they peeled away from the tree, dripping, falling, reshaping. No, not handprints anymore. Hands. Real, charred hands clawing their way free from the bark, the fingers curling, stretching, reaching for her. A scream locked in Emma's throat. The whispers grew louder, the voices blending into something unintelligible, rising into a fevered crescendo. And then she remembered, this wasn't the first time she had been here. A vision slammed into her like a freight train, a little girl standing in the same clearing. Her. Years ago. The black wolf beside her, growling warning. And then the thing in the trees. A monstrous figure, stretching taller than any human, its fingers too long, its face shifting, flickering like a dying flame. It had spoken to her. It had tried to take her. But she had gotten away. Or so she had thought. But now she was back. And it remembered her. Emma's knees buckled, nausea rising in her throat. No, no, this isn't real. This isn't. A shape emerged from the tree. It wasn't fully formed, still bleeding into existence, shifting like smoke trying to become solid. Its face was unfinished, flickering, shifting between something human and something that never had been. And it smiled. The voices stopped. The world stopped. And then it whispered, one final time, "You belong to us now." Emma's scream finally tore free. The darkness swallowed her whole. Emma stood frozen, her breath shallow, her pulse erratic. The forest was silent again, but the weight of unseen eyes pressed against her skin. The handprints, those unnatural, blackened scars, still marred the tree's bark, stretching wider with each passing second, spreading like something alive. And then, the whisper returned, but this time it wasn't soft. It was a chorus. Hundreds of voices, layered over one another, a cacophony of murmurs bleeding into the air. Some were distant, others impossibly close, curling into her ears with eerie precision. "Emma, you've come back." Her stomach turned to ice. Back? A flicker of something surfaced in her mind, something buried deep, an old memory, distorted, hidden behind a thick fog she couldn't quite push through. No, that wasn't possible. She had never been here before. Had she? The wolf's presence was gone, swallowed by the vast nothingness around her. The mist thickened, stretching long, curling tendrils around her legs, slithering like something sentient. And then, a sound. Low. Wet. Like something shifting in the darkness, like flesh peeling away from bone. Emma turned, and the breath in her throat died. The tree, the one covered in handprints, was bleeding. Thick, black ichor seeped from the burn marks, oozing down the bark like tar. The scent hit her next, rotting metallic like old blood left to fester. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath, as if watching what happened next. And then, the tree moved. A deep groan reverberated through the clearing, with straining, cracking. The bark split apart, widening into something unnatural. A mouth. Not carved, not metaphorical. A real, yawning, gaping mouth. It stretched open, impossibly wide, lined with jagged, splintered teeth. The black ichor dripped from its lips, pooling at its base like something alive, writhing in slow, serpentine motions. Emma stumbled back, and then it spoke, a voice that did not belong to any living thing. You should not have come. The clearing shifted. The trees swayed though there was no wind, their trunks twisting like they were alive, writhing in agony. The earth beneath her feet pulsed, breathing, as if the very land itself had become something sentient, something old. And then the handprints moved. One by one, they peeled away from the tree, dripping, falling, reshaping. No, not handprints anymore. Hands. Real, charred hands clawing their way free from the bark, the fingers curling, stretching, reaching for her. A scream locked in Emma's throat. The whispers grew louder, the voices blending into something unintelligible, rising into a fevered crescendo. And then she remembered. This wasn't the first time she had been here. A vision slammed into her like a freight train. A little girl standing in the same clearing. Her. Years ago. The black wolf beside her, growling warning. And then the thing in the trees. A monstrous figure, stretching taller than any human. Its fingers too long. Its face shifting, flickering like a dying flame. It had spoken to her. It had tried to take her, but she had gotten away. Or so she had thought. But now she was back, and it remembered her. Emma's knees buckled, nausea rising in her throat. No, no, this isn't real. This isn't. A shape emerged from the tree. It wasn't fully formed, still bleeding into existence, shifting like smoke, trying to become solid. Its face was unfinished, flickering, shifting between something human and something that never had been. And it smiled. The voices stopped. The world stopped. And then it whispered one final time, "You belong to us now." Emma's scream finally tore free. The darkness swallowed her whole. Darkness swallowed Emma whole. It wasn't like fainting. It wasn't like sleep. It was endless. A void where time unraveled, where sound did not exist. She was floating weightless, caught in the space between waking and something far worse. And then she woke up. A sharp gasp tore from her throat as she sat up, lungs burning, heart hammering so hard it felt like it would break free from her ribs. Cold air stung her skin. Her fingers clawed at the damp earth beneath her, the scent of moss and decay filling her nostrils. She was in the clearing, but it was different. The trees no longer twisted unnaturally. The handprints were gone. The whispering voices had vanished. It was just a forest now, still eerie, still unsettling, but no longer alive in the way it had been. Had it been real? Emma swallowed hard, her throat raw. She felt strange, off, like something inside her had shifted. She could still feel the lingering weight of unseen eyes, but the presence, the thing that had spoken to her, that had remembered her, was gone. The wolves. Her head snapped up, searching desperately for the pack. Nothing. Had they been part of it too? A trick? A warning? Or had they left her behind, abandoning her to whatever horror had tried to claim her? She pushed herself to her feet, every muscle aching, every nerve screaming for her to run, to leave this place and never look back. But as she turned toward the path, she stopped. The black wolf stood at the treeline, watching, his amber eyes locked onto hers, deep and knowing, like he had seen everything, like he understood what had happened better than she ever could. And then he stepped aside. Emma's stomach twisted. Behind him, carved into the bark of a massive tree, was something new. A handprint. Not burned, not charred. A perfect, bloody handprint. Her handprint. Her breath came in shallow, broken gasps. She lifted her shaking hand and pressed it against her chest, then slowly looked down. Her fingers were clean. No blood. No sign that she had touched anything. But the print was still there, fresh, wet, real. Her legs nearly gave out. She had left something behind. Or maybe something had taken a part of her. The black wolf let out a low, mournful sound, somewhere between a growl and a whimper. He held her gaze for a long moment, then turned, disappearing into the trees. Emma knew she would never see him again. She forced her feet to move, tearing herself away from the clearing, from the trees that had almost swallowed her whole. The forest let her go. This time, 1 year later, Emma never spoke about what happened in Blackwood. She tried to convince herself it had been exhaustion, hallucination, a nightmare spun from fear and isolation. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had been there before, and now it would always be with her. Sometimes at night, she still heard it, the whisper, faint, barely noticeable, brushing against the edges of her thoughts. Sometimes, when she passed a tree, she swore she saw a handprint. And sometimes, when she was alone, she felt something watching, waiting. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she walked past a mirror in her bedroom. She froze. Her reflection had stopped walking. It was staring at her. And then, just as her breath caught in her throat, it smiled. The lights flickered. The whisper returned. "Welcome back, Emma." The forest never forgot. And now, neither would she.